at a standstill because they don't really, they can't really go much further. They don't have any more evidence to work with. So, the investigation's kind of not going anywhere. So I guess the Asheville cops were kind of happy to have some of these big city cops come in, and especially someone like Martin, who had that reputation as being a great homicide detective. So as they arrived into town, there was a hotel cook named Banks Taylor, and he actually told the police that Battery Park janitor Martin Moore, a 22-year-old employee there, owned a .32 revolver. So that gave them another piece of evidence, another clue to go on. So cops hurried to question Moore, of course, and after some denials, he led officers to his gun, which at that point had been wrapped in burlap and tucked in a crawl space under his house.
That's kind of weird.
That is kind of weird.
Weird place to keep your gun.
Well, Moore immediately said he had loaned the gun to his coworker, Roddy, and that Roddy had it during the time of the murder and had given it back to him. Well, the weapon was rushed by airplane to New York to a lab in Brooklyn for examination because, of course, we didn't really have the forensics and that kind of big city police work down here in the mountains. Well, while it was being examined in New York at this lab, blonde hairs similar to Clevenger's were said to be found on the weapon.
That'd be consistent with a pistol whipping, wouldn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And there were some bits of blood, splatter on it as well.
Right.
Now, Sheriff Lawrence Brown, who was the Buncombe County Sheriff at the time, announced that Moore had confessed, and he released a 700-word transcript of Moore's confession. Now, later, Moore said, and this is a quote, he said, "I got scared. I figured she was not in the room, but when I got in, she was there, and she screamed. That's why I shot her." So he also stated in his confession that his original plan was to rape the young woman. So first he says he went in there to rob her. He was going to steal from her room. He gets in there. He didn't think she was going to be in there, and she was, and then he panicked and shot her. But then later went on to say, well, because nothing had been taken from the room.
Right.
None of her valuables had been taken. There was a gold watch on the nightstand.
Well, that's kind of weird, though. I mean, the time of night.
Right.
Why would you not expect a guest to be in the room? It's after midnight.
Exactly.
So that's kind of odd.
Yeah, that is. And so then he recanted that story and said, well, I went in to rape her. Right? Well, then he quickly disavowed the confession and said he was coerced by Brown and that he was beaten with a rubber hose by, as he describes, a fat man from New York, which apparently was referring to the Detective Quinn. But a psychiatrist named Dr. Mark Griffin said that Moore confessed to him 4 days later, and he was indicted and placed on trial for his life August 19th, which was just 11 days after leading cops to the pistol. Now, his attorney, J. Scroop Stiles, argued against the legitimacy of the confession squeezed out and said that this man was vulnerable, he was ill-educated, he was young, that he was coerced.
Yeah, you can imagine it's the 30s.
And race is definitely going to play a factor.
He's a young black man.
I mean, we still have these
in the
problems
South
today.
So
but you
that's
definitely
very possible.
are going to see this, 70, 80 years ago.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's a given. It's not even if it happened. It definitely happened. He was handled in a certain way. They instantly probably thought he did it because, they probably still look at him as like a lesser human being than white people. So, I mean, that's very possible.
Well,
that he was beaten.
I mean, this was just not even 60, 70 years after the Civil War.
Right.
I mean, the South was still very racially divided.
Oh,
People
yeah.
were very prejudiced. So I'm sure that his race was a huge factor in this.
Right.
And, when he's saying he was beaten, I mean, that's probably accurate. We still have police brutality. We still have people that are beaten.
Yep.
And under duress when they give confessions.
Yep.
So, very, very likely story, not discrediting that story at all. Well, Moore and his family even testified that he was at a birthday party at the time of the murder.
Well, there's an alibi.
So he had an alibi, But I guess the detectives and the judge, the attorneys were somewhat able to maybe poke some holes in that story. And Judge Don Phillips approved the confession, and the prosecutor, Zeb Nettles, rode that decision, of course, to a victory.
Yeah.
So the jurors, all white, of course.
Yeah, jury of his peers.
Jury of his peers, exactly.
Yeah.
Returned a guilty verdict in only an hour.
Wow.
Yeah. So Moore was condemned to die, and he was placed on a fast track to North Carolina's brand new gas chamber.
Wow.
And somebody wrote, if the verdict stirred Moore, he failed to show it. That is what the court recorder wrote, as he's being sentenced, and the verdict is handed down, his sentence is handed down. So they're saying he didn't show any kind of remorse. He didn't seem upset or scared for his life, that he's just very, straight-faced as he's finding out he's going to the gas chamber. Well, an appeal was brushed aside because Attorney Stiles missed a court-mandated deadline that came just 2 weeks after the trial.
Wouldn't that be poor counsel or, being misrepresented or misrepresented? That's kind of important, a deadline on my appeal for my life. I don't know, but this was, again, back then.
I'm sure this attorney was like, this is swift justice. He's a black man in the South.
For all we know, he could have been getting blowback for representing the guy.
You never know, right? So the NAACP, which had monitored the trial and declared it orderly and apparently fair, had second thoughts. So initially the NAACP said, okay, this seems legit. We're not going to get involved. But then later had those second thoughts, and they created a campaign to try to save Moore's life. But I guess the end came before the group made any progress on trying to overturn his sentence. So on December 11th, now keep in mind, this murder happened in July.
Wow.
So here we are, 5 months later?
Yeah.
Not even quite a full 5 months later. December 11th, 1936, Moore was executed in the gas chamber in Raleigh. And from what I could find in some details, it said that it took him about 12 minutes to die in that gas chamber.
Wow.
Which seems like a while.
Yeah. And so apparently he had no appeals.
No appeals.
He had the one trial. Jury deliberated for an hour, a jury of his peers, an all-white jury of his peers, which is a joke. And then, around 5 months later, he's in the gas chamber.
Well, and if you think about it, the only evidence the police really had to tie him to this murder was the gun.
Right.
Which he did have in his possession and did have, apparently, the blonde hairs that would have gone along with a pistol whipping. And, they said, well, it is a .32 caliber. It's a .32 gun. It was like, that's really kind of the only smoking gun they had.
Why do you keep the gun?
But even if it's like, okay, he's saying he loaned it to someone and got it back. Well, that makes sense. Maybe, he got this gun back, but why would you put it in a burlap sack and hide it under the house? That's the part that I find so weird, is that there's a lot of stuff here that makes me think, well, maybe they got the wrong man.
Right.
But then when you find that, and he led them
he
to
knew
this
the gun was there.
That was under the house. That part's pretty strange.
It is strange.
Because if he didn't know it was under the house, then you could say, arguably, well, maybe he did lend it to someone and they were framing him for this murder.
Yeah, so that's kind of tough there. It's this is us looking back on it decades later, from how we view things nowadays, and obviously we're going to instantly point out he's black in the South and all that.
Well, this was a huge story. It made headlines in the New York Times.
Wow.
In all of these major papers. This was a story that got picked up, on the wires, if you will.
Yeah.
Kind of made national news. This young, blonde, beautiful college student who is very smart, scholarship winner.
Does that sound familiar to the sensationalized murder stories nowadays?
Yeah.
Isn't that funny?
Small town of Asheville, which had notoriety for being like a touristy spot.
Right.
At the time, the Grove Park Inn was only about, 10, 15 years old. It was this resort destination. You had famous people like F. Scott Fitzgerald and his wife hanging out in Asheville and
Right.
visiting these resorts and spas. People were coming here for the healing,
Right.
area, which we get a lot of that today.
Yeah.
So, it was a big deal. And I was actually reading some interviews with local people who remember this story. And there was one gentleman, Booker T. Sherrill, who I guess is kind of a known person in Asheville. He gave an interview years ago where he talked about being an employee at the Battery Park Hotel when this happened.
Wow.
And he is, of course, a black man. And he said that he was off, I guess, at the time that this happened. He actually was getting married like the weekend or whatever of this murder. And so he was off getting married, and that he remembers, the talk, the interview. And he said he honestly didn't think Moore was guilty. He said he just didn't think the guy had the mental capacity to do something like this. And that there was speculation that the owner's son was involved.
Oh, wow.
And I couldn't find anything else about that. But of course, here we are, 80 some years later.
Yeah.
So
it's tough.
It's of course hard to find those details.
It seems like you'd have to be an alpha male type of personality, like a real, to do something like that. Because that's pretty violent.
Well, and what's the motive? I mean, that's
and
the
what
thing
is
that
the motive?
When I'm looking at this case, I mean, with a lot of these, you can kind of see a motive. I mean, we talked about the Nance Dude case last episode.
Right.
And I feel like her motive, one, is, I don't think she was working alone. I think she had help. And two, I think it was an act of desperation.
Right.
Couldn't
take care of the kid, or the parents
like
didn't want, the dad didn't want
cases,
the kid.
And a lot of times you're like, okay, what is the motive? I
Right.
mean, and this is not like a serial type of murder where Martin Moore, if he truly were guilty, had gone off and murdered several people, and she just happened to be a victim of circumstance or opportunity.
Right.
I mean, whoever did this had to get this key. They obviously had to kind of plot it out. They had to know ahead of time, she's this young single female. She's staying in a room alone.
Right.
She doesn't have, because there was even talk about, she kept this very detailed diary. And I said that will come in later to play. Well, she had kept this very detailed diary. And of course, cops thought, well, maybe she had some kind of late night date. Maybe she had been in town for a day or so. Maybe she had met someone.
Yeah.
Maybe she had invited a gentleman caller, perhaps, up to her room and didn't want her uncle to know about it. Or that she had some sort of late night date where she was going to, sneak out and go off for the evening and come back in the wee morning hours. But she had not detailed any of that. And like I said, her diary was pretty open to, everything that was going on. So had she met someone, it would have definitely been in there.
Right.
So then, of course, that was ruled out. So you have to think about the motive.
Doesn't
nothing
appear
was
to be
taken
one.
from the room.
Or it doesn't appear to be one for Mr. Moore to have committed the crime.
Exactly.
Someone had a reason to kill her. You would think.
And what is that reason? And if he's confessing and saying, well, my original idea was to get in there and rob her, or I was going to take stuff, perhaps the person did go in to rob her. She started screaming. They didn't realize they were going to have to kill her. They got freaked out and left. They knew they had to get out of there.
Yeah, it just seems like a bad time to do that. These guests would go off for the day and do a bunch of stuff and go sightseeing. It just seems like you could pick if you're an employee, the comings and goings of the guests. Middle of the day when they're not, it seems like you'd pick when they were for a fact not there.
Well, exactly. And she had just returned. They went to bed at 10:30, and they had just returned from being out for several hours with friends out having dinner on the town.
And it's late. Why would you not expect someone to be in the room at that time of night?
Yeah, so I feel like
That's
the robbery
weird.
motive is definitely questionable. And then when he recanted that confession and said his original plan was to rape her, that honestly makes more sense. But then you have to factor in all of these other things, like was his confession coerced?
Right.
Is it reliable?
Right.
Obviously, race, I think, had a huge factor.
He was fast-tracked. There's no doubt about that. No appeal. How is that even legal back then even?
I know.
No, it's just your lawyer misses a deadline on some paperwork and you get no appeal. And around 5 months later, 12 minutes to die in a gas chamber.
The whole